the idea was to provide you all with a structured approach to remediating GDPR. At HPE, we've been working on this for a good year now. Just to introduce myself before I go on, I work for the EMEA business development team. I come from a sales engineering background and a sales consultancy background. And what I'm charged to do within HPE is to actually go in, identify customers' business problems, and see how, with the solutions that we have on the truck, help customers solve it. So the idea is not to flog something. The idea is to actually solve the business problems that our customers have. Sometimes we're relevant, sometimes we're not. It's better to qualify in or out as best we can. So I'm based, so Louis Vieille-Cessay, I'm based out of the Paris office, and I'm here today just for you. Our initial exposure to GDPR actually wasn't security, and before I go on and talk about what GDPR is, perhaps, and putting us all on a level playing field, just to start with a quick anecdote. Our first exposure to GDPR was back in February last year. I was asked to fly into Zurich to see a major private banking firm, and they said, we have a big problem. This GDPR thing's coming along. We've been archiving all of our customers' banking operations in big daily batch files, and we have their personal information inside. We've been doing this for about 25 years now, and it amounts to something like 180 billion operations that we have. Now, what we'd have to do to be GDPR compliant is to unarchive these, get rid of the people that are now no longer customers, and re-archive them so that we can actually apply retention policies the way the legislation asks for it properly. The thing is, if they did that using the application that they had, and just from the moment they'd press enter with the way the system was built, it would take 750 years. So it's the bit of a business problem for them. Just becoming compliant wasn't just purely from a retention management perspective, which is the way we started getting sort of exposed to GDPR. Led us to think about this holistically. GDPR is not just a retention issue. It's not just a security issue. It's not just a privacy consent issue. It's very holistic. And it's going to be different. The way you have to handle GDPR is going to be different from organization to organization. And what we strive to work for within HPE is to provide a framework that we can actually apply, and so we can help you solve the business problem that you're going to have related to GDPR. Now, GDPR, just as a brief overview, stands for General Data Protection Regulations. So this is now European law. It's applicable as of May next year. So prep time is now, I guess, or is underway in many companies today. And what's it all about? Basically, it's about avoiding this kind of thing. You know, big data breach headlines in the press that we all don't want to see because, you know, we don't want to have a CEO go out in front of everybody, say, we've been breached. I don't know how many, we don't know if personal data's been, is out there. We don't know how many customers are involved. It doesn't look good, and it drives away customers and really hurts the top line. Now, first of all, just to talk very quickly about the content, GDPR, what does it say? It basically says that privacy is a human right. Now, that's nothing new. The European Union already said that in the 1995 Data Protection Directive. The thing that's just, think of GDPR as an update, and if you're into European law, we're moving from a directive, basically the European Union say, you should do this way, to this is the law, you have to do it this way, and if you don't, there are sanctions. Now, the objectives of the regulation is to essentially protect citizens from abusive usage of data. So think about it from making sure that your business teams actually do what's right with the data that they collect from customers, and also protecting, it could also be protecting simply customers from insider threats. That could be relevant depending on the business that you're at. I'll be talking about that a little later on. The second part is protecting citizens from data breaches. What's interesting about this, the regulation in and of itself, it's probably one of the first laws in the world that recognizes the fact that data breaches and hacking from external organizations that want to steal data, money, something from you through your IT infrastructure is a fact of life. So that's quite, it's quite substantive, it's quite important. The authorities understand that security is a problem, it's something that you have to deal with every day, and they've actually built this in, and in the regulation, in the law that they've passed, they actually give guidelines on how to actually improve and work on that. Now, if you break down GDPR in general, what we see is it is basically a condensed version of all the various directives, all the various jurisprudence that we've had on privacy law in Europe for the past 20 or so years, and you can basically break it down into 4 areas. The first part is defensibility, having the appropriate audit trail around the data that you're collecting and about what you actually do with your data and what the citizen has allowed you to do with the data. The second part, and this is, as I said earlier on, the fact that the legislator is actually recognizing that hacking and data breaches are a fact of life. There's this notion of data breach. Under GDPR, if you identify that you've been breached and you have personal data that was under your custody that's now out in the open and for sale on the dark web, for example, you have 72 hours to notify the data protection office in the given country that you operate in. So that's something new. Then there's the notion of consent. You have to manage and all the explicit consent. Right to be forgotten. There is an expiry date that is standard given on the consent that a given citizen will give you on the data usage that you have. And there's finally a notion of privacy by design. Now, privacy by design, I won't go into it because we're going to be moving more into application development, the application development world, and it's a little. There's a lot of things to talk about. It's essentially 7 principles that you have to keep in mind when you actually develop a business process, when you develop an application that will actually handle personal data. Now, Tim earlier on, and I think also the gentleman from Intel who was on just before was saying that a lot of these GDPR aspects and these security aspects need to be passed down from you onto us as vendors, software vendors, particularly those of us who create solutions that handle personal data in some ways. Privacy by design will most certainly one day be a requirement within all of the RFPs that you put out for any solution that you will be issuing. Did that make sense? I don't know. I'm a bit feverish, so if I don't make sense, please call me out for it. Also, one final thing with regards to GDPR, they've identified, the legislature has identified 2 specific kinds of people: the data controller and the data processor. Now, this I don't know if you've come across these expressions before. Basically, the data controller is the end organization who actually does the data collection, who's in charge of actually managing the data in question. If I were to take a very, very trivial and simple example, I work for Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. At Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, we have an HR system, right? For all of our HR operations, HPE, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise, is the data controller. The actual software that we use is Workday. Workday's it's in the cloud. It's a SaaS solution. Workday, in that particular case, are the data processor. Both parties are clearly identified in the legislation and are both equally liable, and both have the same responsibility to protect the data and to provide the sufficient amount of paperwork, transparency on the management of all of this personal data. As I said, GDPR, and this is probably the one that you've come across, is it's now a regulation. It means that it's law. It's now criminal, which means that if your organization is breached, if it's deemed not up to scratch, if you do something that you shouldn't be doing with personal data, if you're handling data and manipulating data without explicit consent from your from the particular citizens, you can the maximum fine that's put to that is 4% of your annual turnover globally. Right, this is the maximum fine, and there's a fine floor of 20 million euros. So it's a 20 million euro minimum, and 4% of your turnover beyond that. So that's ridiculously high. I see a frown in the audience here. Yeah, it's pretty painful. However, I will caveat this by saying this is the maximum fine, and it means that you've been really, really bad. You've not protected data. You've had insider misuse. Your processes aren't transparent. You've not done any of the work that you're supposed to do. So I won't say this is unlikely to happen, but this is the really, really bad case, the worst case scenario. On top of that, you also have civil liability. So beyond the actual fines, you're actually open to class action. And when you think that data breaches can lead to things like identity theft, which can be very, very painful for individuals, there's an uncapped personal liability clause, and you're open to class actions as well. So this is something to take really seriously, and it's important to think about the business outcome, because when you're talking 4% of your annual turnover, this is not margin, whatever, this is turnover, then this has serious ramifications for the CFO. So to really head on in to the session, what we think is, hey, keep calm, prepare for the GDPR, think about the problem that you're facing in a structured, cool and collected manner. I was at a conference 2 weeks ago now in Paris, where we actually had people from the European Data Privacy Board who were there. They actually don't expect everybody to have bulletproof systems in place by May 2018. What they do expect, though, is that that all organizations would be well on the journey to actually building these bulletproof environments. This starts off by you start off by putting the right systems, well, not the systems, sorry, the right processes in place, and then it's about defending and remediating your existing environments as you go along. And this is what GDPR preparation is all about. If you think about GDPR at a high level, right, you've got to think about how your organization uses personal data, how it manages it over time, what's the retention, what operations are done on it, and how the data is secured. So if you think about the holy trinity of GDPR, this would be it. When you look at the personal data that you have in your enterprise, GDPR is about making sure that you're using your data correctly, you're managing your data correctly, and that you're securing it correctly. And based on that, you've got, obviously, we don't all have unlimited means, and this includes HPE, by the way. When I say we, we're an organization like everybody else. We have to be GDPR compliant too. The way we go about remediating and the way we go about solving GDPR has to be it has to be a risk-based assessment of what we want to do. We need to go in and we need to go in, and the decisions that we make, both from an implementation perspective, product acquisition perhaps, change of business process, all of these need to be made on a risk management perspective. Now, the way we go about and do this is we go about and first of all raise awareness. This is what I've been doing for the past sort of 10 minutes or so, is basically to say GDPR is a problem, you need to think about it. And the second part is actually to make a legal impact assessment to a certain extent. what you need to understand is what your organizations need to understand is what is your legal exposure and what should the internal process for personal data management in your organization be based on what you do. Now, I'd love to be able to tell you how to do it, but the fact is I'm not a lawyer, so I won't, quite simply. And usually what we do is that if you don't know who to talk to, we can point you to different law firms with whom we've worked on the issue and who can potentially help you out. Usually the law firms that you employ as part of your daily legal needs will have a GDPR practice because it's something that they're all, as law firms, taking very seriously. The final part is, obviously, now that you've worked with your law firm and you've defined what your processes should be, right? You've got to then make it a reality. Now, make it a reality in, say, a future tool that you're buying. Hey, we're buying a new CRM system. We're going to be collecting loads of personal data from all of our customers. It's quite easy to make sure you just basically put your process criteria into your RFP. The hard part is remediating what you've already got. And the threshold for GDPR actually being relevant is relatively low. We're talking 2,000 customers or 250 employees, because obviously, as employers, all of our organizations hold personal data about you and me, as it were. So if you think about the personal data that you have in an organization and the existing applications, if you were to think of how to approach GDPR, it's actually quite simple. It's about finding the personal data, classifying it, what's in there, and then governing it. So finding, you're going to have two fundamentally different approaches for structured data, data in databases, essentially, and unstructured environments, so basically files, so Excel sheets lying around somewhere, maybe bank statements in PDF form. These all contain personal data, and these could be lying around. You've got to find them, and then you've got to classify them. You've got to understand what's in scope. So of all these things that I found, is this relevant to GDPR or not? One of the problems that we've seen, and if I refer back to the bank that I was talking about earlier on, their problem was over-retention. They were keeping 25-year-old data of customers that had already left. They didn't have to, but they were keeping it because they had to keep some of the data inside the file, right? Their issue was about deleting data that they shouldn't be keeping. So in your classification, you need to identify the data that you need to destroy, and then obviously you need to select the data that you need to govern specifically with regards to life cycle. So when do I delete something, and and how do I manage the consent, and what am I allowed to do with this particular person's details, this particular person's email address? Can I put him in a mailing list? Can I send her some ads via the post? These very simple things. And that's what you do when you essentially apply policy in the govern part. So around all of that, obviously you've got to secure the process. You've got to make sure that the data that you found is not accessible to everybody. The classifications of the data that you've made aren't openly available because you're finding the high-risk, high-value data, right? You're helping yourself be compliant, but you could potentially help the bad guys find the valuable stuff faster. So you've got to secure it. And also part of this, part of GDPR, as I said earlier, is actually securing people's personal data. And we'll be talking a little bit more about that later on. Now, in terms of approach and in terms of actually knowing where each organization is from a maturity standpoint and in terms of what we need to do, we've come up with a framework. We call it Journey to Value. This is something that we do as part of consultative selling with an HP software. And what we've done is we've built one specific for GDPR. The idea is that that we can take you on that compliance journey in a structured manner. right? So we've basically divided GDPR operations and risk into 4 areas. So governance, data processing, security, and encompassing all of that is the impact and the legal risk that you will have. At the core of what GDPR is all about is the actual process, what you actually do with your data as part of your day-to-day business operations. This could be, say, an e-commerce website who are collecting shipping details, bank details from a particular customer. This could be a local council who are simply managing their council tax, for example. You need to understand and look at what we've done is that we've broken down the process of actually capturing the data. So the consent of the customer is given to, for the shipping address and bank details when they actually engage in the act of paying for the particular product that you're selling, right? So you collect the consent, you capture the data, you transform it in a particular way. Say you take the payment details, send them to processing. That's you use them in a particular way. Perhaps you have some reporting saying, oh, today I've sold so much, right? And then obviously you keep the details for a specific, you keep the information for a specific amount of time for retention management purposes, just simply because when you sell something, you need to keep details of what you sold for, I think, 10 years here in the UK. I don't know. It's 10 years in France for sure. And then after that, once that comes to the end of the life cycle, then obviously you destroy it. Essentially, all of this is records management. It's about managing the business records the way you should actually be managing them. On top of this records management, you need to make sure that you have the appropriate oversight and governance in place. You need to make sure that everything that's happening as part of that life cycle process is happening the right way, that you have an appropriate inventory of all the applications that are actually using, handling, analyzing any personal data that you're collecting. You need to understand all of the policies that you have in place, and you need to document all of the policies that you have in place from a retention perspective. You need to design a framework of accountability. If something goes wrong, whose job is it to fix it? And finally, if something goes wrong, how do you fix it? It's not quite final. The second last is all the security standpoints. What happens if you're breached? If you've been breached by an insider, if you've been breached by an external hacker, how do you deal with that? There's also the notion of how do I secure the data that I have? And then finally, you've got your environmental security. How do I make sure that my core data, the precious personal data that I have, that is the risky stuff, as it were, how do I make sure that the environment it is in is well protected? In this case, we're thinking about application security. Am I testing? Am I continually testing the applications that use my personal data? Have I got a proper monitoring of the environment in which of my IT environment? Do I have a SOC? Do I have a SIEM? How does my IT security in general work? So the idea is, from all of that, we help customers build out we build out a maturity model of each organization when we go in with this approach to see customers. And the idea is to help the customer identify areas of risk. Where's the impact? Where's the area of risk? So that the customer can then go in and think about how to remediate. So when we come in and with this consultative sell approach, we say the first goal is to understand the capabilities that you have, what you can already do, and we analyze all of these in detail, right? We go through your tools, your processes, how your organization is structured, and then we build out a roadmap. So what works really well is obviously to have something visual. Like Tim was saying earlier on, if you have a long, verbose report, you can put anything inside it. You can talk about the goldfish, but at the end of the day, the goldfish, it might be dead, nobody really cares, nobody bothers reading it. However, if you have something that's visually compelling, where you actually see a graph, and in this case, what we've built out are star graphs, where we actually rank the maturity based on the evaluations that we've had to essentially help organizations identify where are the key places that they need to invest at a given point in time. And like I said earlier on, we evaluate the organizations on the governance that they have of their environment, the data lifecycle and the management, as well as the security environment. So what does it all boil down to? Essentially a great big questionnaire that we have. It's a process that's completely repeatable, that we can that we essentially run with our consultants. We come in, we interview specific people within organizations, and we have very precise criteria of the level of maturity that would be expected as part of GDPR, and not necessarily just GDPR. This could just be good practice. You could think about the security impact assessment that we do for, as part of our GDPR impact assessment, simply good practice of how should I best be securing my IT environment. So the idea is once we've visually identified these high-risk areas, we can then perform a gap analysis. We can see that in this particular case, we've got security that notification of a data breach to a data protection agency is not something that's properly mature within your organization. You don't know what the process is. You don't know how to contact the data protection authorities. You don't have a quick way of identifying the scope of the breach that you've had, and you don't, the escalation speed that you have is perhaps not up to scratch, and you might go over those infamous 72 hours. Maybe that's something you need to remediate. So in that particular case, once you've identified that if you use that example, it's something that needs to be fixed, you essentially put in, you make a gap analysis, and you see all the work that needs to be done. The idea is that you then build out a roadmap by prioritizing the things that you have to do. We don't all, as I said earlier on, we don't all have unlimited means. We can't fix all of the problems within our organizations. There's not one way of doing things for everybody because we're all different. And on top of that, you're going to have different points of view within your organizations as well, you know, internal politics notwithstanding. So, and after you've devised that roadmap, then there's obviously the implementation part. How do I go about and actually do things? I'll talk a little bit about that later on. So the idea of a roadmap is that you take it through multiple steps. It's not just about saying, I need to do this, I need to do this, I need to do this. It's about saying, where's the value that I have in my current environment, and how do I look for the strategic outcomes of GDPR compliance? It's how do I make GDPR something that actually adds value to my business? Put simply, back to that Swiss bank. I'm going to flog that example to death. Beat them to death. When you think about them, when you think about them, they've been keeping data for over 25 years in some cases that they actually don't need to keep. You know, we're talking about billions of records. Right? This actually takes space. This data's backed up. Purely from an infrastructure perspective, an IT infrastructure perspective, there are savings to be made. Tim in his presentation referred to the tsunami of data that we're currently sort of we're basically being submerged by data all the time, right? It's if we have good data management policies in place, and if we're securing the data, which is essentially one of the key corporate assets today, and if we're securing it properly, if we're managing it properly, then obviously the risk of the costs of actually managing it, all that, aren't as likely to go out of control based on the data growth that we have as if we didn't. Today, there's a real financial incentive beyond the legal incentive of GDPR to actually start doing that properly. So now that we've sort of understood what we need to do as part of GDPR, and I'm going to have a glass of water because it's making me thirsty. There's a whole challenge of actually remediating GDPR in applications that you already have. Say, and here I'll give another example because we're sick and tired of that Swiss bank. Where, say, we have another customer, and this time it's close to home. It's here in the UK. They're an insurance company. Sorry, it's still financial services, but in their particular case, what they had is that they had data portability regulations that came in, and they managed everything they could as best they could within their CRM system. The thing is, all of the sales operations that they performed were then, because they're an insurance company, they were then copied over into the data warehouse. Data travels. Data is used in one place, it's used in another place. And that makes securing it that much tougher. And what happened with them is that they were very good at protecting the CRM layer and making sure that accessibility was very well managed at the top level. But once you got into the data warehouse, where you got some very complex operations going on, they have in there they had all of their pricing operations. They didn't want to delete any of that data because all of the historical data is what they calculated insurance premiums on. So this is very, very valuable business intelligence data. Problem was, personal data had flown into the BI environment, and in their particular case, all the claims made for a specific kind of incident got pinched by insiders with all the personal data. So that data then went up for sale, and you had a whole bunch of ambulance chasers calling loads of customers from that insurance company saying, oh, you've had this kind of incident. Do you want legal protection? How can we help you log the claims, etc.? And they got fined by the Data Protection Office here in the UK on this as a result. So they were doing the right thing at the top level, where they were capturing data, the consent, deleting data from customers, but old stuff that was in a secondary environment was not protected as best it should. And so there again, they had data that had been kept there for far too long, but also the data had not been protected the way it should have. So in their particular case, they went through a very similar framework, a very similar way. They knew where the problem was. They knew which particular applications were at risk, so that the finding and the classification weren't so much of an issue. They were talking about a very specific mainframe database. They were talking about very specific data warehouse applications. What they wanted to do was implement the appropriate policies in terms of data protection and in terms of lifecycle management again. So once they'd found the data, and this is a generic slide, it's not linked specifically to that customer, once you've found the data, then obviously you've got to classify it, and once they've done that, then the way we did it with this customer is that we used 2 HPE tools. Finally, I get there. And like I said earlier, you've got 2 very fundamental different types of data out there. You've got structured data, and you've got unstructured data. And we're going to both address, and we both address these very specifically, discreetly, in their own with their own particularities, because you can't speak to a database the same way you speak to a file system. Sounds obvious. So what we use for structured data is a tool called Structured Data Manager. Essentially, when you think about it, originally it's an ILM tool. It's an information lifecycle management tool. It's about taking data out of your existing ERP system, HR system, moving all the data that's no longer useful into an archive database. The idea is to reduce database bloat, reduce the amount of space that you use, reduce the amount of power, CPU power, that you have to apply to your system, and reduce the times required in your batch processes. What we've done is that we've kind of hacked our own tool to actually help fix the GDPR problem. So what we do is that we connect to the database, we decide what we want to take and have a look at within the database, and we essentially take a sample capture. We make a temporary copy of some of the data so that we can, and we then put it into a cache database so that we can then go and analyze it. What we essentially do is that we go through each column of each table that we've taken in our design, and we run regression analysis to find PII. We have a PII library. I'll talk about that later. What we then do is that we can then provide reports saying, in this particular table, this column has first names, this column has last names, this column has social security numbers. Once you know what you have where, you can then apply the appropriate policy on the data that you have. And this is key. You need to understand what you have before you actually start protecting it. For control point, for unstructured data, it's a very similar story. What we do in this particular case is we actually use a search engine. We use a connector, connect to a particular environment, and we index it. We can do full text index, so we index everything, and every document that we have is searchable. But what we usually do is a specific metadata search. So instead of indexing the entire document while we index, we make the search engine parse the documents and find, again, using the same metadata library that I was, the same PII library I was talking about, find any reference to a social security number, a bank account, a first name, a last name, any document and any kind of PII we can find within a particular document. We have a tool to actually find that. And all of that comes out in a reporting UI. So you can point the tool at a particular SharePoint environment. I'm not talking site. I'm talking a whole SharePoint farm. And it'll tell you, in your SharePoint farm, you have 300 documents in which you have a bank account number, this many documents where you have credit card details, this amount of documents with social security numbers. You can actually find the stuff. Now, what we use to do that, and I mentioned it earlier on, is we have a tool. We use a tool as part of the indexing process called eduction, where we basically extract a named entity or a structured entity from a document. And we have a library, and we've had it, and we've had it for what? I think we started working on this kind of thing in 1996, if memory serves correct. And we've built out these these metadata structures, as it were. So what does a social security number look like in the UK, in France, in Germany, in Canada, in Turkey? All of this we've actually logged, we've structured, and we can actually identify. And we can then report on. The beauty of this is that in both cases, both Control Point and Structured Data Manager is not just about reporting. It's also about taking action. Both tools can actually go back into the source environment, move something, delete something, encrypt something if you really need to. The really important part, like I was saying earlier on, is for all the data processes that you have, essentially you need to keep accurate records of what you're actually up to with the personal data. So once you've analyzed it, analyzed your environments, whether they're structured or unstructured, and you know where personal documents or databases that have personal information are, once you know where they are, you can then obviously extract the reports that you found, and you can log them in so that you have the appropriate level of transparency that the regulators are going to expect from you under GDPR. The thing is, once you know what you have, you then need to act upon the source environments, as I was saying. So once you've got the appropriate traceability, the appropriate audit chain of where is the data? Based on that, you have your policies, as I said earlier. You've worked with your law firms before coming to talk to us. You know what you need to do with the data that you actually have, and therefore you have policies to apply to that data. These policies, you can have them in the records repository, and you can have them executed by the records management environment to essentially manage the data that you've found, analyzed, identified. You manage it in place. And this is one of the key capabilities that we have within our HPE portfolio. In the midst of all that, what's really important, again, is to secure the data that you have. You need to, most of the time, identifying personal data is just half of the problem. What you want to do is encrypt it. Now, encrypting is, it's easier, first of all, it's easier said than done. When data transits from multiple environments through multiple environments, it gets a lot tougher to manage, and I'll talk about that a little later, because we have a very cool technology on that front as well. Now, if you were to think about, and so this is actually a slide that we presented to the insurance company earlier on, right? This is the exact system that they put in place. They knew that they had a specific number of pricing applications in their data warehouse, right, that were using, in which they had personal data they didn't necessarily know about in the first place. They just knew there was some personal data there. So what we did is that we used the structured data manager to essentially identify where the personal data was, to feed that as sort of proxy records. We don't take all of the personal data and copy it into the records management solution, because that's just copying data, and that's not what we really want. We want to manage the data. We don't want to copy it. And so we declare what we refer to as proxy records. We log in the solution where personally identifiable information is and what characteristics they have. We can then have users set up the appropriate policies, so usually with the help of a lawyer, and we then execute these policies. Now, the policies then come back to structured data manager, who can then do what the policy says you should do with the data. Bear in mind, not all of your policies are going to be retention-based. They can be security-based as well. So in some cases, you may want to, and obviously you've also got feasibility constraints as well. In some cases, you can just delete a record. You may not necessarily want to do that. And in the case of the particular insurance company, they didn't want to do that at all, because if they delete a record, they're actually deleting information that's useful to construct the pricing of particular insurance policies. So they didn't want to do that. So what they did want to do was to redact, overwrite permanently the personal data so that it's unusable, particularly the stuff that's no longer valid, perhaps clients that have left, whatever. In other cases, so you can delete and redact based on what your policy is, but you can also protect. And this is something that we're seeing that's of increased interest, is basically reverse engineering encryption, format preserving encryption, Tim mentioned this earlier on, into an application. And why would you want to do that? Well, essentially, if you think about GDPR, and if you look at GDPR very specifically, one of the things, the other technology aspect that the regulators and the legislators, when they actually wrote the law, called out, so they talked about hacking, but the other technology piece that they actually called out was privacy-enhancing technology. And the words that they used were, sorry, it's a bit of a mouthful, pseudonymization. Basically, they say the best kind of security is to basically pseudonymize data. Instead of having data in the clear, having Louis Vieille-Cessay's first name, his address, his bank details, all in a row, we make it look like something else. We give him an alias, right? Now, doing that it's particularly complicated to reverse engineer, but it just so happens we have technology to actually do that at HPE. It's from a very cool tool that HPE acquired about 18 months ago from a company called Voltage. It's a tool called Secure Data. So basically what it does is that it's format preserving encryption. So if you look at traditional encryption, right, what you'll have is when you look at, say, Gunther Robertson's tax ID, right, if you encrypt it using a regular AES key, you're going to have a big line of gobbledygook that's a lot longer than the original content that you have. You're also not going to have the same character types. You're not going to have the same format. You're not, which is going to become a big problem at your application, at the application architecture level. You're going to cause data bloatage, and you can actually break the application that's actually using the data. So not particularly helpful, right? Now, what format preserving encryption does, and format preserving encryption is actually it's certified by NIST, so it has its own AES code. It's AES FF1. What we do is that we take part or the complete, say, tax ID of Gunther Robertson, and we keep maybe some of it the same, but we change bits of it. But that's not a random change. It's actually encryption. It's encrypted. It's entirely reversible. So when you talk about pseudonymization, there is this notion of reversibility, and we can do that, and we can use the tool to target, for example, tax IDs, but also social security numbers, date of birth, and first names and last names. And we keep the data the same size. We keep the information format the same size, so that it doesn't actually break your application. So that's pretty useful. What's very important to say as well is that there is because we're using encryption, right? There is a notion of it's going to be sorry, just brain freeze. I can think of the word in French, but in English it's popped out of my head. Basically, the data is going to be the same. Once you've encrypted, if you encrypt the same data, right, or data that looks the same, say Gunther Robertson's date of birth is sort of, well, it's here in this example, it's the 8th of July, 1966. Well, if you had, say, somebody else, Joe Bloggs, was also born on the 8th of July, 1966, then the way the encryption runs on the data is going to be the same, and therefore, once the encryption is run, Gunther Robertson's going to be on the 1st of February 72, so will Joe Bloggs. So essentially, if you encrypt, for example, a unique customer identifier, then a unique customer identifier, it'll be different, but it'll still be the same from customer to customer. In other words, a lot of even though you've encrypted the data, a lot of the batch process that you want to do can still be maintained and run without necessarily you having to decrypt the data in the first place, because obviously, you know, encryption's one thing, and you know, data bloatage is one thing, but you also require CPU power to encrypt and decrypt, and the idea is that you want to minimize the amount of work that you have to do on that front. So essentially what you have is James Potter, Ryan Johnson, Carrie Young. These names are completely encrypted. They become illegible, unusable. The social security numbers are all jumbled up, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so the referential integrity, that's the word I was looking for, is maintained. And we can protect an environment, and your application doesn't break simply because you've implemented encryption or you've reverse implemented encryption. Now, this is what's also useful to know is that this can be applied in a stateless form. Now, if we move on to how you encrypt and decrypt, the data doesn't necessarily have, the encryption doesn't necessarily have to be application specific. You can encrypt the data that comes into your CRM application. So it's actually stored and encrypted in the CRM application. When you copy the encrypted, you copy the encrypted data. But the application can call upon the same set of decryption, the same decryption processes, so that you can actually read the data decrypted or partially decrypted if you have the rights. Now, how do we manage the rights? How do we manage the keys? This is the second sort of innovative piece of this actual tool. Instead of actually having a key server where we'll store encryption keys for every single operation that we do, which would be colossal when you think about it, if you have to keep a key for every single encryption operation that we do. What we do is that we keep a base key. And so we encrypt everything using a base key. Well, actually, we use the base key to generate a key to encrypt or decrypt the data. And the rights to actually have these keys to encrypt and decrypt data are generated on the fly, and being able to have them is, or having access to these, is going to be based on specific user identity. What we've done is that instead of keeping lots of keys and saying, here, person A, person B, person C, you have rights to this amount of data, and here is your key, the fact that you log in, right, based on your identity, the appropriate decryption key for a specific set of data is generated on the fly. It may sound trivial, but from just from a functional perspective, you essentially have two problems, the encryption problem and the identity management problem, and you're linking the two together. Suddenly, the encryption of your data and the securing of your data becomes the same problem as simply managing who has access to what application. Access to the application and access to the data can be managed centrally from one system, which significantly plays into decomplexifying your security environment. Yeah, so a little animation. So just quick note on performance, just to finish up before opening up to Q&A. Like I said earlier on, encryption and decryption takes a lot on performance. You need CPU to encrypt and decrypt. Like I mentioned earlier, because of referential integrity, you can actually run a lot of operations within a given application on encrypted data. You don't actually have to decrypt it to actually run some of your batch processes. Whereas, and because you're not encrypting all of the data inside your actual database, you're only targeting what needs to be encrypted, then you can still run a lot of the batch processes without going through the decryption procedure. The idea is that the decryption procedure only happens at an end user access level. So when someone wants to actually see the data on the screen. And so when the application is actually calling for specific data with specific access rights. Now, so in general, if I'd have to sort of conclude and talk about GDPR and give a big picture, like I said, it's about finding, classifying, and governing the data that you have, securing the data using encryption that I talked about earlier on, but then it's also about application security. How secure are my applications? We can protect the data at rest all we want, but if your front-end application isn't sufficiently secure and a hacker can put a tool to basically listen in on everything that's coming in before it's even encrypted, then you still have a data breach. So beyond the actual data that you're encrypting, whether it be, you need to think about the application ecosystem, and then beyond that, you need to think about your IT ecosystem and the security intelligence. To come back to what Tim was saying, the central part is about knowing what you have, knowing what you need to defend, and knowing what the bad guys are after and how they're going to get it. This is where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck in terms of defending yourself. But to defend yourself, you mustn't leave out the middle pieces, because that's the concrete part of the defense, as it were, to the personal data that the bad guys are after, and that the European Commission don't want you to lose, essentially. So with that, thanks. I hope it was of interest. It's very dense. It's a bit tough after lunch. Q&A? Yes.
Can I have your presentation?
Yeah. If you come to us on the HP stand afterwards, and I can supply you with a PDF copy if you want. Yep. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
I've got quite a few years of tobacco to take. Now, do I need to go through all those tapes and decrypt, then edit the data, then re-encrypt? Do you have a tool that can do that quickly?
I think I'm gonna answer your question with another question. What's the difference between backup and archives? No, it's actually a fundamental question. Because when you think about it from a data management perspective, a lot of companies are actually thinking archiving and how do I keep my data and keeping my data over the long term by using backup tools. Backup tools, when you think about it, what are they actually for? They're there for business continuity. So theoretically, your backup tool is there to help you switch the lights back on if your data center's been hit by a meteor, right? But your archives are something completely different. It's what you're keeping, or what you need to keep for business purposes, right? Yep.
I do need to restore historic data for purposes.
Yep. Yeah. No. It's. But the thing is, it's like the problem that. Yeah, I'm a bit cagey in my response, but granted, the thing is, from a process perspective, a lot of companies have over time used their backups as their archives. What I'm saying is that it's not necessarily best practice. So if you think about it, perhaps what you'd want to do, and what you should think about doing is restoring what you have, or restoring sort of the old stuff, and maybe the first investment that you need to make, for example, for GDPR, is not security. Perhaps it's a good old records management solution to make sure that the data that you do need to restore periodically is actually in a system where its life cycle is governed, separate to your operating environment, and that your backup system now has the sole purpose is that actually just switching the lights back on if your data center gets hit by a comet.
It's killing two birds with one stone. Potentially, I've got petabytes of data. That's an enormous task.
Yeah, it's similar to that Swiss bank, I guess. It's sometimes, and we all see it. Sometimes strategic decisions made in the past come back to bite us hard.